We open by saying that two major topics. The first one is artificial intelligence, and the second one is geopolitics. So we are rolling into part two here, the geopolitics part. We're going to be talking about innovation and geopolitics in three domains. In space, in oceans, and in energy. To set the stage for us and to navigate us through this, obviously, geopolitics at some level, if we'd had this conversation a few years ago, we could have done this in kind of an academic way. We probably wouldn't have done it at all because it just wouldn't have been important enough to put on the agenda for our community. But today it is absolutely important enough to be on our agenda. And when Haig Ferris made his comments earlier about innovation and conflict, in particular war, he gave us some examples to set the stage for the backdrop here. Leading us through this is Professor Janice Stein. So she's going to take over from me in just a moment. My job is to introduce her. She is an expert in Middle East conflict. She's an expert in effectively geopolitics and economics, Russia-China, Ukraine-Russia, US-China, and Ukraine-Russia, and so on. All kinds of accolades, university professor at Toronto, Order of Canada, Royal Society of Canada, and so on. I met Janice standing waiting for an elevator. Actually, I should say she met me. I had met her 2 decades earlier when I crowded into Grant Hall at Queen's University to listen to Professor Janice Stein. I'd heard about her for a long time. I'd seen her on the CBC. And so everybody was elbowing their way in. I was a first-year professor at Queen's trying to get a seat. Couldn't wait to hear from this person that I'd heard so much about and seen on television. And to me, she was a larger-than-life figure. So when they announced her and she walked up, and she was so tiny that I imagined her to be so huge. Anyhow, we met at an elevator. She met me because I had known her for 20 years. She had no idea who I was. So we were standing in an elevator, and she was standing beside me. We're waiting. And I introduced myself, and I said, "You don't know who I am, but I've followed you for the past 20 years. And so over the course of waiting for the elevator and going up maybe 10 floors, she told me about a paper she was working on. And by the end of the elevator ride, she said, "I'm going to send you the paper." And so she sent me the paper, and the paper was on 5G. And I thought, okay, I've read a lot about 5G. I don't think, I'm not sure I'm going to learn anything new here. And what it was a paper about rebordering the world based on different technologies in different places in the stack. And depending on effectively which country's technologies each country was getting in terms of accessing the World Wide Web, that she characterized in her paper as the American-led web. It's not worldwide at all, she argued. That the borders of the world are being recast based on whose technologies you're putting into your stack. Routers, servers, software. And so as we read through the paper, I immediately forwarded it to Avi and Joshua and said, "Have you guys seen this? Who is, she's actively working right in the domain that we're interested in." And so in addition to being such a celebrated scholar and a translator for the general public, like what she was doing in the CBC, she also became a great mentor to all of us running CDL. So this is not just her applying her expertise in her trade, but also a great honor for us because she's been such a leader. Thank you very much, Janice.
Thank you so much today. That's such a generous introduction. Just 2 quick comments. One, there's a great example of where virtual reality is better than reality Jay would never have known how short I was unless I showed up in person, okay? The second comment was a comment that Jay made to me just a couple of days ago. And he said, I've heard more about geopolitics in the last 9 months than I've heard in my life, and it's probably enough to last me a lifetime. Well, here's the news, okay, Ajay? After a 25-year vacation, great power competition is back. It is part of all of our lives, and the even more important news, it's not going on holiday anytime soon again. Now, it's not new for you and for Darren and others. We have seen this movie before, but every version of the movie is different in each age. So what's different about the period that we are now living in? And how does that affect all of you in this room? The first is that geopolitics is now also geoeconomics. And it is laser focused on the work that all of you do. It is laser focused on the most advanced technologies. So this is now going to border your worlds in a way that you probably have not experienced for the last 30 years. Jay on the panel that, and you did, that in earlier rounds, many of the most advanced technologies were incubated early on by governments. DARPA supported the internet. For those of you who know the history of the internet, it came out of a small Pentagon and changed beyond belief, frankly, what its early designers thought it would do. Well, today, that relationship is reversed. And that's why all the most advanced technologies are actually being developed by you in the private sector. It's flipped, right? And so that's the great news. All the most advanced technologies are being developed by you in the private sector. Here's the not so great news. You are now, every one of you in this room, a strategic asset for your government. Because your government is in a new position. It doesn't understand the technologies, it's not developed inside, and it doesn't know how to buy them from you. But it knows that it needs you. And so not only are you focused on the technology, but government is focused on you. The third way this is different this round is you, and it's the people in this room and people like you who've reset the clock on change. And let me be candid here. Our institutions, I'll include our universities, I'll include our governments, and I'll include our international institutions, cannot keep up. They're not fit for purpose, frankly, if we're being honest. And the lag is growing. And it's only by creating a sense of urgency in these institutions about dealing with the issues that Darren put on the table. Okay, last way this is different, and was it you, Anusha, this morning who raised this issue? I know it was Rihanna for sure who raised this issue about, and I understood Rihanna's point really to be, and that sets constraints on how we want to regulate ourselves and ourselves. I think we have to be very careful as we draw implications from what will be the defining relationship, certainly for the next decade. Let me make just one comment in my own wheelhouse and then move on. What I can say to you, and it's going to be hard for many of you to believe this, China feels threatened by the United States in the same way that the United States feels threatened by China. And that is not a good story when we look back at history, frankly. So we have to be careful what we're doing. But we are in the most rapidly changing moment in the history of this relationship. You remember Janet Yellen was in Canada not too long ago, actually to visit Chrystia Freeland, our finance minister, and she talked about decoupling, friendshoring. We've moved on. We are now talking about de-risking and building a high fence. So think of the visual here, a high fence around a small yard. In that small yard are what you're doing. The most advanced technologies in the most advanced technology sector. And that's why the subject is important. Now, we couldn't be more fortunate in the three people that we have with us today. Chris Hadfield, Commander Hatfield, has flown 3 space missions, built 2 space stations, performed 2 spacewalks, and is the first Canadian to command the International Space Station. He's an astronaut, an engineer, and a military fighter pilot who was named the top test pilot in the US Air Force. But what's really extraordinary about Chris, he writes novels. And if you haven't read them, you are missing an incredible treat. And on Chris's desk this morning, sitting 2 over from me, was the new one. He has the advanced copy. It's called The Defector. You don't have it in your pocket, do you, Chris? Okay, it's called The Defector. It's coming out in October 2023. Give yourself a treat. It's a book. It's actually, that you turn, okay? Next to Chris is the incomparable John Risley, who's chairman and CEO of CFFI Ventures. And he's also chair of the MDA Corporation in Canada, which has brought space back to Canada in a commercial way. And it is, in fact, an iconic company. But how I have gotten to know John as somebody who an incredibly deep set of commitments to this country, to Canada, to its welfare, is an incredibly smart critic of what we're doing wrong and how we can be better, and then digs in, gets into the nitty-gritty, learns the details, builds the coalitions, and get things moving. Great to have you here, John. And finally, Ann Welligan, who is an investment management executive, a corporate director, an entrepreneur, and a philanthropist. What a great combination to have. He's the founder and partner of ARC Financial, but he is also the co-founder and chairman of Viewpoint Investment Partners. Again, a long-time thinker about what energy policy in this country needs to do, how we manage the transition to the future, and somebody who speaks to power in an incredibly effective way. Chris is going to start us off, space, innovation, geopolitics. John is going to follow oceans management, and geopolitics. Mac is going to bring us home with energy, geopolitics, and then we're going to have a conversation among the 4 of us. So over to you, Chris. Over to you, Commander.
Great. Thanks, Janice. It's funny seeing people wearing sunglasses in the front row. Space geopolitics is new. This is the very first vehicle that made it into space. It was during 1957, the International Geophysical Year, and the Soviet Union, for the very first time, had the technology to allow us to leave the planet. An enormous step change in capability. And as Haig was saying, very much the direct product of military investment and military development, but also a demonstration of military capability. But Sputnik itself was pretty humble. It was just a medicine ball-sized thing that beeped and went around the world. But people immediately saw the incredible potential of being able to leave Earth. And from Sputnik in October, by the way, there's probably a bunch of people here that speak Russian. Little Traveler, Little Voyager, really cool name, Sputnik. But Sputnik, even though it really didn't do anything on its own, within the time since 1957, this is now the number of Sputniks that we have traveling around the world. This is an exaggerated diagram, obviously. It doesn't, I've lived in space for half a year. It does not look like that. Each one of those blips would be the size of, I don't know, Toronto in order to show up. But the numbers are huge. We currently have almost 8,000 active satellites going around the world. We have about 2,200 dead satellites going around the world, and then they run into each other, or there are bits that fell off them. If things are bigger than 10 centimeters, so whatever that is, the size of, I don't know, your iPad or something, there's 37,000 of those. Things that are between 1 and 10 centimeters, about 1 million of those are orbiting the world. And things smaller than a centimeter, you know, smaller than whatever, your baby fingernail, there's about 130 million of those orbiting the world right now. So why? Because when given a new technological capability, suddenly people realize there is tremendous advantage to getting there. It's location, location, location. It's an opportunity for all types of different applications. You know, people all that we can communicate better, we can spy on each other better, we can understand and explore science in weightlessness, look at our own weather, we can explore for the first time, not just like Galileo in whatever, 1610, having a look through polished glass, but actually go look. And we can put weaponry up there if we choose to, and we can better understand our own Earth. But back then, of course, it was only trillionaires that could fly in space. You had to be one of the 2 world superpowers just to be able to fly in space. So when we're talking of space, it is the continuing advent of technology that has so radically changed that, so that 2 months ago, we launched the latest version of a Sputnik rocket, the latest Vostok, which is Elon Musk and SpaceX's Starship, which is over twice as powerful as the Saturn V was that took us to the moon. The biggest, most powerful rocket humanity has ever built. And it was a first test flight. They learned a huge amount. But within the next couple of years, that's going to be giving us orbiting the world and accessing space in a way that no longer is it only the opportunity for trillionaires and nations, but it's hard to see if you're in the back, but this shows the radical decrease of cost of access to space since Sputnik up until Starship. And the left scale of cost is logarithmic. When my kilograms were put into space, it was on the order of $50,000 or $60,000 a kilogram to get me into space. With Starship, it should be on the order of $200 or $300 a kilogram to get things into space, which means that that same list of things that you can do, the reason we've put those millions of bits of human-made stuff into orbit is now available to all, as Janice said, all the government agents that are in this room, all of the individuals who are now trying to pursue entrepreneurial ideas in order to answer some or all of those questions. But we're not just going to Earth orbit. Something we discovered very recently about the moon, because of our exploration and because of the more altruistic works of our governments, is that the equators are dry, but the poles, not only do you have sunlight always, but you got water. The craters are full of ice. By our best guess, about 400 billion liters of water. So if you're looking at the long-term allure and opportunity that exists, if you have eternal solar power, so you can generate energy, like we'll be talking about here in a minute, and you've got a deep water resource, then all you need is a good habitat, and you can live there. And the American-led coalition of space explorers right now has already identified a bunch of landing sites where they want to go. It's just an extension of the reason all of those bits are orbiting the world right now. It is opportunity. It's a chance for us to do something different. The moon is a huge, untapped, and completely lifeless geology. And it's an advantageous territory. And that Starship, it's still in its fledgling days, but NASA has already hired it as one of their vehicles in order to put people on the moon. And we're not very far away from, which is, I mean, it's just a nice glitzy SpaceX-generated graphic, but it's a solar-powered, water-fed human settlement on the moon. And it looks crazy, but imagine if I'd been given this same talk in 1905 talking about Antarctica, or whatever, 800 years ago talking about New Zealand. I mean, it seems incredibly and impossible until someone develops this technology to get there and live there, and then it just becomes a further extension. We already have a thriving Earth orbit economic system. We're about to have a thriving Earth-Moon economic system driven by improvements in technology and better Sputniks than we had at the beginning. But obviously, it's not just the American-led geopolitical use of this, but China has been extreme, and the other great superpower right now has been extremely active in improving their technology, and this is their high-tech graphic of what their base on the moon is going to look like. They don't have quite as good graphic artists as Elon does, apparently, but the head of the Chinese lunar or exploration space program said 2 weeks ago, oh yeah, we'll have people on the moon by 2030, no problem. And if you look at their incremental and deliberate development for the last 20 years, I believe them. 2030 is only 6.5 years from now. I mean, 6.5 years ago was like, what, 2017? It's almost here. And if you overlay where NASA has said they're going to land and where China says they're going to land, it's all about real estate. You know, everybody wants sunny waterfront property. And and that's what you have on the south of the moon. You always have the sun because it's perfectly upright in the solar system, and you've got all that water. So we are leading inexorably towards continuation and escalation of conflict over territory. And in fact, Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense of the U.S., was trying to get a meeting with his equivalent, the Minister of National Defense of China. They were at a big summit in Singapore. I don't know if you were there recently, but they couldn't even work it out to meet each other. This is the only before dinner, sort of like us while we had our bathroom break, they shook hands. And if you look at the two of them, they're about as far apart as two humans can be and still manage to shake hands in the middle. And to me, that picture is just a visual remonstration of how difficult the geopolitics are right now, both on Earth and in space. And the balloon, the Chinese spy balloon that suddenly we became aware of, although spy balloons have been going on since the 1700s, this demonstrated a shifting perception of American will in understanding of the domestic nature of an international threat. What's going on in Ukraine right now has also highlighted the importance of space assets in sovereignty and domestic protection. Communications, situational awareness, jamming, all that other stuff that's going on up there. And I think what's intriguing is that it has taken what was a sitcom just a few years ago, and people watched it to laugh, and turned that into a real, fundamental, very much American public accepted agency of the Department of Defense. That is a huge political shift of what's been going on in space and how we view the threats from above, and something that we need to solve. But there are lots of peaceful reasons to continue to explore space, and it's up to us. The enemy of my enemy is my friend is an old aphorism. The Earth gets hit by 40 tons of meteorites a day. 40 tons of rock hits our planet every day. And once in a while, a great big one hits us. That's a common problem. If we knew one was coming, we would stop struggling over, land problems in Ukraine, and we might focus together on the existential solution of that problem. And the extrapolation from that singular Cold War expression of power of Sputnik to just a couple weeks ago when 17 human beings were in space, still on 2 different space stations, the Chinese space station and then all of the international people that were on the International Space Station, but 17 people living and working in orbit. As Janice said, I used to be a combat fighter pilot against the Soviet Union in the 1980s, intercepting armed Soviet bombers off the coast of North America. And yet we have found ways, and we absolutely need it. And I head up an organization that is looking at trying to establish policy that will help us find new common ways to how it is, because settling the moon is not just a technological problem, it is a sociological problem. Whose laws? Antarctica is different than China and different than Canada and different than the United States. And how we settle the moon, how we set up policy on the moon, it's a new start for all of us. And so the Open Lunar Foundation is working on that. And next week, I'm working with a project called the Astra Carta. And the whole purpose of that is to try and use, the king has no authority but all sorts of public awareness and convening power. And he's just trying to do his best to use his convening power to get people all to the same table that otherwise wouldn't maybe find an ability like the 2 ministers of defense to talk to each other, so that we can try. He's drafting in the order of the Magna Carta and the Carta Foresta, the Astra Carta, to try and set up a set of rules that as many CEOs and government organizations will become party to, and we'll be announcing it officially on the 28th of June as well. And this is my last slide. CDL is a big part of the solution. The reason that I lead the space stream here is we can bring, this was in Paris this year, we can bring people from all around the world to look at that history of problems and look at the opportunities and think about how can we be part of this long-term continuum? How can our collective inventiveness find ways to contribute to the long-term outcome of this that we all want? And good luck at the super session here. And this, Janice, you plugged my book for me, which I really appreciate. And these are all the books that I've written. So anyway, there's my new one, The Defector, by The Defector. It's Father's Day. Go ahead. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Always difficult to follow this guy. He talked about sunglasses, and I watched Siobhan put her sunglasses on up on the stage, and I said to myself, gee, that looks pretty cool. I've got a set of sunglasses somewhere in my bag, and I went rummaging around, and I remembered what my granddaughter had told me some time ago, which was that, Bubba, she calls me, at your age, there's no hope of looking cool, so sunglasses are still in the bag. Look, I do a lot of this sort of talking, not this particular talk, and this is a really important talk. And it's a really important talk because it's really important to me that you understand the importance of the ocean. And not just because it's an economic engine of all kinds of opportunity, but because the ocean holds, in my opinion, a huge part of society, climate, and what the world is going to be. And I want to take 5 minutes to explain to you why that should be important to you. So you think about it, as I said, sectors here: energy transition, food security, transport, climate, and in pretty meaningful ways. So some of you will be aware that we have offshore wind farms around the world. Offshore wind tends to be better quality than the wind onshore. It's steadier, and that's really important. So what's the opportunity for Canada, and what's the opportunity generally? Sable Island is an island about 8 kilometers off the coast of Nova Scotia. It's a sand island. It's got big, huge sandbanks around it, shallow water. I've actually been out there, really cool place to go. But it's got a really great wind resource, and the potential of that wind resource is to produce 17 gigawatts of power. Now, to put that in perspective, that's more power than Hydro-Quebec produces today. It's more power. It's actually almost three times the size of the entire power base consumed in Atlantic Canada. This is a big deal. It's $5 billion. $75 billion. When did we have an industry in Canada that was $75 billion? The advent of the oil sands in Alberta have we had an industry that could be that impactful. I mean, if we developed that resource and we developed offshore wind resource, we would have no unemployment in rural Atlantic Canada, I guarantee you. That's the significance of that. Apart from obviously it being a hugely important component to energy transition, this power actually doesn't, power gets used to make hydrogen, and because it's cheap power to produce, we can produce hydrogen economically, green hydrogen, and we can ship it to parts of the world where electricity is very expensive to produce. Aquaculture is a booming industry. The sustainable wild harvest fishery is a mature, stable industry if we're lucky. All the growth and protein coming from the oceans is going to come from aquaculture, and that is a function of technology has driven this business, and it's going to continue to be super important in its future development. This is let me just see if I've got the right slide here. Yeah, so this is the slide I want. This is to talk about climate. We need to remove from the atmosphere 10 billion tons of carbon by 2050, right? 10 billion tons. The little red dot on the bottom left is what we've removed so far, right? It just gives you a glimpse as to the problem. Now, the good news is that there are lots of ways that the ocean can play a meaningful role in harvesting carbon. And just to put it in perspective, and I bet this is a data point that most of you will not know, 80% of all the carbon that we have produced since the beginning of the industrial age is stored in the ocean. 80%. Over 30% of the carbon that we produce today on an annual basis gets stored in the ocean. So it's a hugely, hugely important component going on in the climate. And we need to know more about it. I mean, I understand this sort of that it's all about the rainforests, and I'm not suggesting the rainforests are not important. They are a fraction of the importance of the ocean in how we can manage and deal with the climate issues that the world faces over the course of the next 50 years if we're really going to do something meaningful. Will we get to 2050? Will we get to net zero by 2050? In my opinion, not a hope. Not a hope. But we can't try. We absolutely have to try. Transport, this is a really big problem because ships burn what's called the bottom of the barrel, and that's the dirty oil. It's the cheap oil. It's the stuff that sends all kinds of particulate matter up into the air. And the answer to this is coming. We are going to have ammonia-fueled ships in 2024, 2025, so this is a problem that is going to get solved. And again, I don't need to tell this audience about the scary that we're facing with climate change. But I just came back from a conference in New York on Thursday and Friday of last week, mostly populated by scientists. And the capacity of the ocean to do what the ocean has done over the course of the last 200 years in storing this 80% of all the carbon we produced, that is coming under pressure. And there's a lot of concern amongst ocean scientists as to the capacity of the ocean to continue to do what it's done for the past 100 years. And my point is we need more research in this area. We need more global cooperation. There's only one ocean, just like there's only one climate, and technology is at the heart of all this. Just again, to give you a sense of the size of the prize, coming back to the financial side of things, because I'm at my heart, I'm a business guy, and you can see the size of the Norwegian. This is the size of GDP. Norway's ocean economy is 37% of GDP. That would mean that our ocean economy is over $300 billion if we could match Norway in terms of the importance of ocean to our economy, and gives you an indication of the potential. Thank you.
Okay, so let's just get right into it. And let me start by saying, after a few decades of investing and building businesses, I want to start by saying that one of my most profound, at least profound for me, learnings has been around how to assess strategy and how to know good strategy from bad strategy. But the test of success, ultimately, no matter how visionary, how ambitious, how bold, or how noble, is in the results. As Winston Churchill famously said, however beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally look at the results. And this points to what is arguably, I believe, the most profound and impactful geopolitical strategic misjudgment in modern history. The energy transition shifted from ambition to implementation, and early results evidence a great and costly failure in policy and strategy, certainly in Europe. As Europe was phasing out baseload coal, zero-emitting nuclear power, inhibiting or rejecting natural gas development, including LNG receiving facilities, all for environmental reasons, and very importantly to recognize, doing all of this at the same time, they walked into a massive energy security issue with an overdependence on a notoriously unreliable supplier. The failure was not simply the outlook that Russia would behave cooperatively and could be relied upon as a trading partner, because I hear that often. Well, you know, Russia attacked Ukraine, nobody could have foreseen the consequences of that. That's not the point I'm trying to make. The point I want to make is that it was the size of the bet that was placed on the outlook. And that's why I want to introduce that issue in the context of strategy. In strategy, it's axiomatic. Don't bet the farm. If you're wrong, you may lose everything. European decision makers lost sight of the big strategic risks and trade-offs. Germany and the UK and much of Europe put everything on the line: energy and geopolitical security, economic security, including livelihoods and the stability for the people to whom they were responsible, affordability, including fertilizer-related food prices and the impact on general price levels, corporate and industrial competitiveness, and broadly societal prosperity. All that is essential to modern society was put at risk. European own credibility at risk and arguably the credibility of the energy transition itself. At ARC Financial, over the past 30 or so years, we've invested in over 150 businesses across the full energy spectrum, from renewables, clean technology, even batteries years ago, to infrastructure, yes, oil sands, traditional oil and gas. We are now the largest private equity investor focused on energy in Canada. Profitability, value creation, quality of opportunities and assets, all the traditional investment metrics are all critical. But first and foremost, we invest in leadership. And we're loath to throw good money after bad, even if the leaders involved appear visionary, intelligent, believable, and are likable. Here is the critical energy and geopolitical question of the day. Who now wants to follow the German, the UK, or the EU model on climate leadership and economic and strategic leadership more generally? That sounds harsh, but I live in that world where we have to make those assessments. As Germany and Europe now scramble to build LNG receiving facilities and contracts for supplies, where's the credibility when European-led financial institutions, notably the European Investment Bank, discourage natural gas projects in developing countries, notably Africa, which is home to many of the poorest people of the world? I would point to that as a significant growing geopolitical risk, lots of tension, because those countries are turning elsewhere for support. The almost absolute fixation on one essential outcome of energy policy, notably reducing emissions, created a form of tunnel vision, a degree of blindness to other long-standing essential basics of energy policy: security, reliability, and affordability. I was saying to Janet earlier that in going back and forth to Ottawa, now when some of us talk about those basics, we're engaged in conversation, whereas before, all that we could talk about was how to reduce emissions. In the context of these essential basics, it's clear that energy policy in Europe failed. All the costs and damages of energy policy will be felt for years, maybe decades. The resulting credibility problem, very importantly, it's not in the decarbonize and reduce climate risk, nor is it simply targets and results, as most critics argue. It is first and foremost a failure in strategy implementation, and more broadly in strategic risk oversight. This leads naturally to my second major point on what has shifted within energy and geopolitics, and that is recent policies and actions of the United States. The United States has stepped squarely into the leadership void, reflecting a much different mindset and strategy. The US mindset is comprehensive and pragmatic versus the more narrow and technocratic approach of Europe's Green New Deal and related highly technical taxonomies. There's no question recent US policies include ambitious climate legislation, but it is all within the well-established basics of energy policy, with the first priority being security. To quote Senator Manchin, the main architect and sponsor of this legislation, the IRA was and is shaped to achieve one goal: energy security, by utilizing all our nation's abundant resources. His words indicate the breadth of the new US policy. To quote, over the long term, this could help increase the production of renewable and also fossil fuel energy, reduce energy costs for hardworking Americans, and provide the means for America to support our most energy vulnerable allies. There's a lot in that statement. We'll have to see how it evolves. But current US policies, at the very least we can say, represent a serious attempt to integrate decarbonization ambitions into economic competitiveness and industrial policy. Europe is something similar. The US strategy is technologically and energy source agnostic, unlike Europe's technocratic green taxonomy. The US is largely incentive and market-based versus relying on heavy regulatory mandates. The incentives are massive, involving, as we all know, hundreds of billions of dollars, and any company willing to meet the requirements in the legislation can. Under the question, fighting climate change or funding fossil fuels, David Cohen, U.S. Ambassador to Canada, in a recent CTV interview said, "The United States absolutely wants it both ways." And I mention that as an example of U.S. pragmatism and realism. It is imperative that we reduce emissions, but we must find the optimal path where the imperatives of geopolitical and economic security are satisfied, and the imperatives of household affordability and business competitiveness are satisfied, and the imperatives of social and governance stability are satisfied. This is all highly complex, yes, and highly political, but this is where we're at in the world at this time. The alternative model represented by recent policy initiatives in the United States is attempting to do all of this, and it has become the benchmark. All countries of the world will take note and adjust, and certainly that is true for Canada, as Canada is attempting to pivot towards the US model and compete with their incentives. The implications to energy investors, innovators, and entrepreneurs are highly positive. There's lots of opportunity broadly across the energy complex, from decarbonizing traditional energy to finding new low-carbon alternatives and efficiencies, including, very importantly, with the grid. I am optimistic to the extent that we take our leadership cues from the US model and mindset, the mindset being reflected. But the reality is that the success of the US model is not a sure thing as we move forward. We will have to heed Winston Churchill's advice and watch the results closely as all of this is being implemented. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Max. So Ajay just sent me a nod and a wink and said, we don't have much time, and you can't stand between all these good people and lunch, but yes, I can. So I'm going to go one fast round here, one lightning round, because we heard from Chris about all the opportunities for collaboration, even when there's keen geopolitical contact. We heard from John how absolutely critical it is to get this generation of oceans management policy, right? And there's urgency. You could hear it in John's voice, and I share it, by the way. And we heard from Mac, strategy eats everything else for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and we need to be focused on results. Okay, a quick round from each one of you. What's the one tangible to do that you would recommend that would meet one or both of these objectives? Enhance the capacity to collaborate across borders when they're going tough right now, and also help our institutions, our governments, partner better than they are now so that they can meet the urgency that John talked about. Let me start with you, Chris. One idea from each of you.
One quick answer.
Is it on?
One, two. Just one quick answer, and I think it applies very much from a CDL mindset as well as the policymakers in the room, and that is don't try and design policies and technological solutions that only bet on the solutions that we're using right now and the regulatory framework that we have right now and the peace that we have right now or the war that we have right now. But instead, do your absolute best to like Max said, to look at where are we going to be? Where are these technologies taking us? What is a good bet for a strategy for where we're going to be in 5 years? And try and then build your policy based on the foundation of the technological advances like internet from space or cheap access to space. Nobody is properly building how we're going to take advantage of what Starship is going to do for us, because it's much more comforting to go with what you know. So that's my thought to everybody on the space side. It is rapidly changing, and you need to bet on the come to some degree and look for policy for the middle, further future.
So look, I would argue that it's the responsibility of everybody in this room to be informed. The climate issue is not somebody else's problem. It's everybody's problem, and that starts with you. And I don't know how you engage in debate. I don't know how you weigh the trade-offs. I don't know how you can articulate positions or decide how to vote if you're not well informed and on these issues. And look, I'm not first to put up my hand and say I learn every day, and I'm lucky to learn, and I realize how much there is to learn. And I can tell you that I am shit scared about the future of the climate on this planet. And I'm shit scared because I don't believe that the targets that governments have set are achievable. And I'm worried that business has not yet grappled and the consumer has not grappled with the fact that green costs more. It just costs more. And so face up to it, right? But the problem is not going to get solved individually. It starts with people being educated, and it ends up with global institutions. This is not Canada's problem, it's a global problem. And we need global institutions, of which Canada is a meaningful player, that can engage and discuss and debate this. And there's examples of we have lots of global institutions. We're cooperating in space, right? We cooperate geopolitically at the United Nations. So we just need to get on with this, and we need to get on with this with a sense of urgency.
It's a real conundrum because we do have to move with a real sense of urgency, but if we're not careful, if we move too quickly and we're in a sense too urgent, as Europe was, we can make some strategic misjudgments. And I say that in all friendliness to my friend John and others who argue for that. I mean, we need urgency, but we need to be strategic, and we need to be intelligent, and we need to learn from our mistakes. We need to learn from what happened in Europe, why the dependency on Russia took place, what the mindset was, and look at the consequences and the damage that it has caused. And we need to understand that. And it's not just simply a matter of putting security ahead of environment or anything like that. It is a mindset. It's a way of looking at solving problems.
Thank you so much. This one's dead too. Thank you so much. Really great presentations. Let me add one final note before I let you go. One of the really great things about CDL, for me, and one of the reasons I'm so happy to be a part of it, is you get in a room with people with different perspectives, and you have a chance to learn, right? If I had to pick one institutional flaw, that's our problem, that we have siloed institutions, and these kinds of conversations are not going on across the sector. So if you walk out of this panel, either from Darren's or the one we just had now, with any sense that we are compelled, reach out to somebody who works in a different field. Figure out what you know together. You know, we all understand where the AI, generative AI is going. It's wiring together loads of computers, but we find it hard to share knowledge across sectors with another human. Make that your CDL mission for the year. And if you can reach out to somebody in government at any level, if you reach out to somebody in another sector, and you say, there's this problem, what do you know, what do I know? Do you see something I don't see? That's a start. In other words, I would say, as Ajay would say, just do something. Thank you all.